All right, so let's now implement truly private class fields and methods. So private class fields and methods are actually part of a bigger proposal for improving and changing JavaScript classes, which is simply called class fields. Now, this class fields proposal is currently at stage 3, and so right now it's actually not yet part of the JavaScript language. However, being at stage 3 means that it's very likely that at some point it will move forward to stage number 4, and then it will actually become a part of the JavaScript language. And that is probably going to happen some point soon in the future. And that's why I decided to already include class fields in this course. And in fact, some parts of this proposal actually already work in Google Chrome, but other parts don't. At least not at the time of recording this video. Now, for starters, why is this proposal actually called class fields? Well, in traditional OOP languages like Java and C++, properties are usually called fields. So what this means is that with this new proposal, JavaScript is moving away from the idea that classes are just syntactic sugar over constructor functions. Because with these new class features, classes actually start to have abilities that we didn't previously have with constructor functions. And many developers consider this to be a big problem, but personally, I'm not sure if it is such a big deal for the average JavaScript developer. So as long as you still understand how prototypal inheritance and function constructors work, then I believe that you will be fine. But anyway, no matter if you end up using these new class features, let's now start exploring them. So in this proposal, there are actually 4 different kinds of fields and methods. And actually it's even 8, but in this video, I'm just going to focus on these 4. And that's public fields, that is private fields, and then we have public methods, and we have private methods. So essentially, there is a public and a private version of both fields and methods. And let's now start with public fields. So we can think of a field as a property that will be on all instances. So that's why we can also call this a public instance field. So basically in our example here, the 2 fields could be the movements and the locale, because these are basically 2 properties that are going to be on all the objects that we create with this class. Because we do not pass any of the values here in, so into the constructor, and so this array and this language, they will always be set for all the instances, right? And so let's now add them as public fields. So that works simply like this. We can say locale equal and then navigator dot language. And then here we actually need to write a semicolon, which is kind of weird because between these methods, we do not need commas or semicolons. What's also weird is that this kind of looks like a variable here, right? But we don't have to declare it using like const or let. So this is how we simply define a public field. So let's write that here. So public fields. And the other one is going to be this movements. And I will still, for now, call it underscore movements. And so I'm setting it to this empty array now. And so when we reload this now, you will see that then the account here works exactly the same. So we still have the locale here and also the movements. But now they are actually public fields. But in our final object here, that doesn't make any difference. Because again, these public fields here are going to be present on all the instances that we are creating through the class. So they are not on a prototype. So this is important to understand. So all these methods that we add here, they will always be added to the prototype, right? But again, the fields here, they are on the instances. So let me write that here as well. And so again, having this here is essentially exactly the same as this. And therefore, these public fields, they are also referenceable by the this keyword, and they are also referenceable via the this keyword. Great. So that's public fields. Next up, let's talk about private fields. So this is number 2. This is number 1. Let's add that here as well. So just to keep a nice overview of all the things that we are learning here in this lecture. All right. So private fields is the one that we have actually been waiting for. So with private fields, we can now make it so that properties are really, truly not accessible from the outside. So just like in the last lecture, let's start by now finally making the movements array private. So let's move it here. And now I will remove the underscore, and then I will use the hash symbol. And so this is the syntax that makes a field private in this new class proposal. So let's try and reload to see what happens now. And indeed, we get some error. And the reason for that is that the property is now really called hash movements. So we need to change that everywhere. So both here and here. Yeah, that's it. Give it a save, and now it all works. So let's see. Here we now actually have the movements in this array, which is called hash movements now, basically. And so now we are finally going to be able to see that this property is indeed protected. So if we try to read account1.movements, then we get a syntax error. So private field movements must be declared in an enclosing class. So basically JavaScript thinks that I'm trying to implement this private class field out here, and that's the reason for this error. But what matters is that in fact we cannot access this variable outside here. And of course the movement property from before does now no longer exist. So we get undefined there. Now the error message here might look different for you by the time that you're watching this video. Because as I said, this proposal at the time of recording is not really finished yet. And so some implementation details might still change. And so that might also affect the error message here. And speaking of implementation, I believe that right now only Google Chrome actually supports these private class fields. And so make sure to also test your code in Google Chrome. But anyway, the movements are now truly private and no longer accessible outside here, at least not by their property. We do still have, of course, this method here in our public API. And so this one we can still use to get the movements. So that's right here. And that was indeed the whole point of creating this method in the first place in the last lecture. Now the next candidate to make private is this pin. So in the last lecture we protected it, but now just like the movements, we want to convert it to a truly private field. However, this time the situation is a bit different, because now we are actually setting the pin based on this input value to the constructor. However, we cannot define a field in the constructor. So the fields, they really have to be out here, outside of any method. So what we have to do is to create the field out here, so the private field, again with hash, and then don't set it to anything. And so this is essentially just like creating an empty variable. So in the beginning, this will be set to undefined, and then here we can redefine that value basically. And so one more time, we can see that these class fields are really just like any other property. That's why later down here, we can then access it on the this keyword and set it to the value that we received. So let's try that. And indeed, the pin here is now also a protected field, or actually a private field. And so when we try to access it, we will no longer be able to do that. All right. So that is truly private class fields. And again, these are going to be available on the instances themselves. So not on the prototype. And so, yeah, of course, that's why we have them right here in the instance. Now, some people don't like the way that the syntax looks here with the hash symbol, and there has been a lot of discussion going on. Now, I don't mind it at all. I just like to focus on the benefits that this new syntax gives us. There is a slight change that it might still change before the proposal reaches stage 4, but in this case, I will simply go ahead and update this video. But anyway, next up we have public methods. And actually, that is nothing new at this point. So all these methods here that we have been using are indeed public methods. So in this case, there is not a lot to talk about. And in fact, we had already written something similar here. So saying that all of these methods together are basically the public interface of our class. And so therefore, let's move on to our final point here, which is private methods. So let's do that down here. And private methods, as we already mentioned earlier, are very useful to hide the implementation details from the outside. And that's why in the previous lecture, we already made this method protected with this underscore. And so let's now grab this and put it down here. And now to make a private method, the syntax is exactly the same as private fields. So just like with the hash. Now the big problem here is that right now no browser actually supports this. So I can just show you how it works in the code, but unfortunately I cannot show you how it works. So if I save this now, I will probably get some error. And so yeah, the first one is that this function now no longer exists. So let's change that here as well. And well, we don't get any error actually. So that's surprising to me. Let's see what we have here. So indeed, here we have the approve loan now. So I guess that right now Google Chrome simply made this method like a private field. So that's why it no longer appears in the prototype. Right? So it's not here, but now it's instead on the instance. So that's not really what we want. Let's just test if we can access it out here. So console.log account1 dot approve loan with some value. And then we get the same error as before. So private field approve loan. And so, yeah, it's just as I said. So Google Chrome right now basically sees this as a private class field and not as a method. And so that's why I was saying that the methods are not really yet implemented in Google Chrome. So private methods are not available. And so let me just leave it here as a comment, but I will go back to simply protect it with the underscore convention. All right. So at some point in the future, this will work. But for now, let's leave it just as it was before. Okay. So we talked about these 4 features here. So public fields, private fields, public methods, and private methods. Now, besides these 4, there's also the static version of the same 4. And that's why I said in the beginning that actually we have 8 new features. So there's also the private version. And actually, and that's not private, that is static. All right. And actually, we already used the static public method before. And so that worked by simply adding the static keyword in front of it. Remember? So just static and then some method name. And so usually we use this for helper functions because these static methods will not be available on all the instances, but only on the class itself. Remember? So this static one here only works like this. So account.helper. And so, as I said, there's also a static version for all the other 3 ones, but I'm not going to show them to you now in this video because they are really less important. And if you want, you can of course easily test them out by yourself. Okay, and that's actually it. So this is how we implement encapsulation and data privacy using the new class fields proposal that hopefully at some point will really become part of the JavaScript language.